Joseph Saxon, thank you very much for taking time to talk with us and to tell us about your memories when you were an Air Force officer at Dover. Did you just to get started? Did you finish? Did you retire from the Air Force?
Yes, I did,
Okay,
and
and
that was in 1994.
1994. And was that so? Was it a 20-year time in the Air Force?
It was just shy of 20 years.
Just shy of 20. So when Jonestown happened and you were at Dover, that was pretty early in your career in the Air Force.
Yes, it was. I was a second lieutenant when that occurred.
Boy, okay. And what was your job at that time?
I was the deputy chief of public affairs for the 436 Military Airlift Wing, and
Okay.
as such, I participated in uh, operating the media relations program, community relations, and our internal information program.
So as a second lieutenant, and then this huge news event happens and Dover gets pulled into it. Um, and I imagine there must have been a lot of media who descended on Dover.
Yeah, we had for that day quite a bit of media. At that time, there was no 24/7 cable news system in effect, but also on that particular day when the first remains started coming back, that was Thanksgiving, I believe. And so
Wow.
Thanksgiving and Christmas are the two family days. So there wasn't a lot of news happening on that particular day. And so we were the news.
Yeah, wow. Well, let's back up a little bit. When did you first hear of People's Temple or Jonestown? Was this something you were aware of before November 1978?
No, I first became aware of it that Saturday when I was watching the news, and I saw the human remains in the jungle, and I got a phone call after that newscast went off, and it was from our headquarters at the Military Airlift Command, and they inquired if I were aware of what had happened, if I were watching the news, and I told them I was, and they said, do you see those remains in the jungle? And I said, yes. And they told me, get ready, they're coming your way.
Really? Wow. And this was, I mean, the event I believe took place on a Saturday, so not even 24 hours had gone by when you had an indication that the bodies were going to come your way
That's correct.
to Dover. Okay, so this gets to an interesting question because and you and I have discussed this a little bit before, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on this. One of the folks who's written a number of books about People's Temple and Jonestown has asked why the bodies did not go to an air base in Oakland, which apparently had, or at least the claim is, had a large mortuary. And this person's claim in the books is that Dover was chosen. There are three reasons given why Dover was chosen. One, that it was closer to Washington, D.C. and would be easier then for federal officials to get there. Secondly, that it was closer to Guyana, and so the planes would not have to refuel. And thirdly, that authorities wanted some separation between the families, since most of the family members lived in California. There's some concern that family members might, for lack of a better way of putting it, get in the way. Do you have any thoughts about about that claim that the bodies could have gone to Oakland, but they went to Dover for those reasons?
I don't have any direct knowledge of that, but I think it was closer to fly the remains to Dover,
Yeah.
and it would have made sense to take them to Dover because you would have wanted some separation to allow the pathologists and the forensic staff to perform their duties. The processing the remains of 911 people was not something I don't think that had ever occurred at one facility in our country at one time. And so it was a unique situation, a unique setting, and we would have needed, like I said, just some space to be able to do that job efficiently and quickly.
Yeah, so you mean by space, you mean not having to, trying to think of a diplomatic way of putting it, or even a humane way of putting it, but not having to.
Well, if you had hundreds or thousands of family members,
right.
on the scene, it would have complicated our ability to process the human remains.
Right, sure.
And to return them to the family.
Sure. Right, and so that makes some sense. What are your so within 24 hours, you've got a phone call that now Second Lieutenant Saxon is almost certainly going to be dealing with media in his capacity as a public affairs officer. What are your first memories of the remains from Jonestown actually showing up? I mean, when you think about those coffins or caskets, whatever the right word is, first showing up in Dover, what are your first memories of that?
Well, before they arrived, there was a great deal of preparation that had to be conducted at the base, and for our part in the public affairs arena, we had to ensure that there were enough telephones and typewriters for the media. So we had to set up a media center. Back in those days, there were no cell phones, and so you had to have a phone bank available. You had to have typewriters available. So we had to set that up, and then the honor guard, as I recall, was called upon to conduct a ceremony for the first of the remains that arrived, so that they could be handled with care and dignity.
Really? Okay. Oh, so I didn't know that. This was for the first remains that came in?
That's correct. And then, we had to make arrangements for to get the media there and to have an area where they were allowed to view the observation, to observe the remains coming off of the plane and being onboarded to vehicles.
Wow. As this preparation is going, I'm imagining this kind of consumes all of the energy at the base, right? I mean, was this sort of an all-consuming thing, even for folks who aren't involved? Was this just sort of an all-consuming thing at the base, the recognition that, as time goes on, at first we think we have 300 and something bodies, and then the number goes up, and eventually we get up to 900. Did this kind of almost consume the life of the Air Force Base for a while?
It did, for about 3 or 4 days. It was a all hands on deck situation, in that you needed to have volunteers to assist. There were, as you indicated, a large number of human remains that had to be moved and had to be placed into appropriate settings in the hangars so that we could hold the remains prior to sending them forth to the west, primarily to the West Coast. So there were a lot of volunteers that were needed to assist in that effort.
Yeah, and I don't know of a lot of cases, but I know of, well, there's one specific case I know of where a fellow, volunteers to help, and after a couple hours of it, he just says, "I can't do this anymore." Do you know if that became a bit of a challenge, where some of the guys and gals as well who volunteered. But after a while, they just said they didn't want to do it anymore. Do you remember that being one of the challenges that came up?
I don't know that that was an issue for us because keep in mind when this nation over the years has called upon its military to step up into the arena and to provide service where for things that they were uniquely qualified for.
Yeah.
And that was the case here. Our men and women in uniform, they stepped up, they volunteered, and they performed their duties. And I think they performed them to the best of their abilities. I'm not aware of anyone who was not willing to provide their services to assist in any way.
Sure. Yeah. So you described the atmosphere at the outset, all hands on deck, let's get ready, and the media is going to be here, and so there's that fact as well, just that not only do we have our jobs to do, but some of it's going to end up on camera. Let's fast forward a couple weeks after that initial sort of rush has passed. Did the having these 900 plus bodies on the base, did that continue to affect the atmosphere at Dover in any way that you can remember?
I don't think that having the remains on base affected folks as much as going through that initial process of getting the remains prepared for transport and eventual burial.
Yeah.
The initial onboarding of the bodies, preparing them, trying to identify those as best they could using primarily dental records.
Yeah.
And then getting them processed and into the caskets. That initial effort was the major impact to the base, I would imagine.
Yeah.
But once those remains were processed, they were put into a hangar, and I'm not sure how long it was before they were moved. It wasn't. I don't know that. I don't know when they were actually moved. Maybe you have some record of that.
I think even into into 1979, it took it. I don't know exactly. I think it took a few months at least.
Yeah, February stands out as to I think when the last remains left.
Yeah, yeah. What do you remember in terms of the caskets coming back from Guyana and arriving in Dover? What are some of the things you remember seeing?
Well, the remains were inside of the caskets, so
Right, yeah.
From our vantage point, that's what we saw. We saw the outside shell.
Yeah, yeah.
We saw the caskets, the aluminum caskets. We did not observe any of, or at least I did not observe any of the human remains.
Right, yeah, that's right. Now, were some of the caskets different sizes? I mean, did they have, for lack of a
they
better
were.
way, child size?
Yeah, you had 911 victims of this mass murder / suicide.
Yeah.
But there were about 200 caskets that were just a couple of feet long. And those were the human remains of infants who were born outside of the country and for whom no records existed. And that was the big tragedy in all of this. The adults made a decision to go down, for better or worse. But they made their own decision. But the children didn't have a choice in that. And so, they accompanied their parents to Jonestown, and they were murdered down there.
Yeah.
And and in the end, many of them, probably most of those 200, nobody knew to whom they were related. And so that for me was the biggest tragedy of all of this.
Yeah, right. My understanding is that in Oakland, California, there's kind of a mass grave for children who were never identified. In this time, did you have any personal interaction with family members? Of course, physically, most of the family members are in California, but did some try to get through to you on the phone or communicate with you in other ways?
I believe some family members did talk to personnel within our office, and some came to the gate and ended up at a makeshift family resource center.
Okay, yeah. So one of the things that's interesting is that your name comes up in at least 2 books by the same author. And this author, when she reflects on, the decision to take the bodies to Dover and various things is generally, and these books were written in the mid-1980s, so, and she lost family members in Jonestown, so we take all of that into consideration. But generally not very happy with how things worked out in terms of dealing with the bodies. But your name comes up in both cases as someone who is appreciated. In fact, I don't know if you're aware of this, but actually in the acknowledgments section of one of the books, your name is mentioned as one of the people who was sympathetic and kind in an atmosphere that generally did not seem to be very sympathetic and kind. I'm wondering what your reaction is to that, the claim that these are family members who were trying to figure out what was going on, and they felt like, they were hitting a lot of indifference or apathy or even hostility. But then they do have memories of you as being someone who is unusually in that context sympathetic. I'm interested in your response to that.
Well, I appreciate someone saying that that they had experienced a kindness from me, but I think in this particular situation, you're looking at something that was of a magnitude that overwhelmed many, many, many people. I'm sure the families were overwhelmed.
Sure.
Those who had to deal with the remains were overwhelmed. I know that I would imagine that some of our policymakers were stumped in terms of how to deal with a mass casualty event on this scale.
Yeah.
You're talking about almost 1,000 people who perished, and so trying to find a way to efficiently deal with that is not something that most people can readily do.
Right.
Things that we do every day, the routine things that occur in our lives, we probably do very well.
Mm-hmm.
But the things that happen one time, the things that we have no experience dealing with, those are the ones that are most problematic because there is no experience level for you to draw upon. And so with this situation, people they just did the best that they could. But I can understand it, from a particular family member's perspective, trying to find out if a loved one was involved could be frustrating, because I don't know that that they performed many identifications prior to the remains arriving. I think that initially, I think that initially the plan was to do that, but I don't think that that actually occurred. And so
Yeah.
you've got all of these human remains arriving at Dover, and they have to be identified. And so I think they had 35 pathologists there and 29 or 30 other forensic folks who are augmenting the Dover mortuary staff. And so it would have taken some time to acquire the records and to work through the identifications. And I imagine that, that process of doing that led to a high degree of frustration with many of the families.
Sure. Yeah, I hear that. I just have a couple more questions. I'm wondering, just as you look back, or just reflect back on yourself as a young second lieutenant, and all of a sudden you've got this massive story that you're dealing with as a public affairs officer. What was your impression of the media at the time? Because of course the media did a lot to shape the story. That's what the media does. What was your impression of the media at the time?
Well, the media can be kind of difficult because you have a natural competitiveness among media. And so when you're trying to gather them all up to take them somewhere, and if you're trying to keep them in a group, you're going to find that that those competitive juices rise to the surface, and you'll get photographers of competing newspapers or magazines, or competing media not wanting to be in the same area as their competitor, because they may be afraid that that person is going to take their shot, or so you'll get that type of thing. But overall, the media, I thought, played it pretty straight. There was one gentleman who tried to pay off a truck driver to slip him into the back of the mortuary so that he could get a camera shot.
Wow. Yeah.
We didn't allow media back there because the doors were open to the facility, and we didn't think it was in anyone's best interest to show human remains.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. I hear that. Well, I know in a career, in a full career with the Air Force, you're involved in other historically important events. So did this, once this whole episode is wrapped up at Dover, and you carry on with your career, then did the story just kind of pass for you as well, or did you find yourself over the years just kind of interested in this story and interested in finding out what happened, and how did all these people end up at Dover and all that? What was your own kind of reaction to the broader story that led to these 900 plus remains coming to Dover?
Well, when I look back over this, the thing that I'm struck by is that you've got people who made decisions, and they put their fate or their lives and the lives of their family into a man. And the problem with putting your life in control of someone else like that, because you're outside of the country in a place called Guyana, in Jonestown, and your freedom is limited. And so the problem with putting yourself into that type of situation is that when you're dealing with these guys with a messiah complex, like the David Koresh's of the world or the Adolf Hitlers, when they go over the edge, they have a tendency to take their followers with them.
Yeah.
And so one of the lessons I learned from that was that you can never, ever afford to put yourself in a position where you're not in control of your actions in your life.
Yeah.
You know, while I was at Dover, a couple of years after that, you know, I got a chance to look back on this, and it was a tragedy, but
yeah,
there were other things that happened in my career. Like I said, a couple of years after that, I recall that I got a phone call from the Associated Press, and it was a reporter inquiring about 6 hostages, not hostages, 6 former employees of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, at our U.S. Embassy in Iran, who were en route to Dover Air Force Base. And so I went down to see the wing commander to let him know that we had gotten a query, and, you know, he took me with him, and when this plane touched down on American soil, there were 2 people standing there. And it was just, you know, I found it interesting that, you know, you had these folks coming out of Iran, these 6 escapees, and, you know, and the only people there were he and I when that plane touched down. And so I had a chance to deal with that, to be a part of that. About a year after that, I ended up in Turkey at Incirlik Air Base. And it was the middle of a civil war. And about 8 months after I had arrived in country, or maybe about 6 months after I had arrived, the military overthrew the civilian government, because at the time, like I said, you had a four-way civil war. You have leftists fighting rightists, fighting Islamists who were at war with fascists. And so I had a chance to see what happens when a country is in the throes of a civil war like that. And so I had a chance to see what happens in that type of situation. But when I step away from all of that, I think that the thing that had the biggest impact on my life was what had happened at Jonestown. Like I said, that was seeing those 200 coffins.
For the children.
That made that stuck with me. It showed, you know, that you've got to take care of your children, and you have to make decisions that, you know, in life you make decisions that you may not necessarily want to do at the time, but you do it to benefit your family. You know, you've got to take care of your family. You got to take care of your kids. You can't leave it to somebody else to do that. You have to be responsible for that yourself.
I hear you. Just to follow up, when you're mentioning Iran, that was related to the Iranian Revolution of '79?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, so, you know, it's interesting just listening to you talk about these 3 events. It just confirms what I've gathered, you know, talking to so many military veterans, and that is, you know, most people read about history while it's happening in the newspaper, but if you're in the military, you have a pretty good chance of actually participating in it. And
that's true for a lot of people.
Yeah, and you certainly did. Well, Joseph Saxon, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your memories. It's an important part of the story, and I appreciate you taking the time to share your memories with us.